I want to talk about modes of learning, all right? Or if you want to think about it, levels of learning. We'll start at the base, and then we'll move up to a more advanced level, and then to the most advanced level. And I'm going to make classifications here on how you take in knowledge and use it, okay? So I'm going to use a schema or a schematic or an idea or a structure, if you will, a concept from classical times, classical Rome. Let's go back to classical Rome, and really a little bit before that, for in the Hellenized Greek era. And I want to talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay, now that was called the Trivium because there are three, and they went together in terms of somebody's education. Now down the line, four more subjects were added. Okay, and those were called the Quadrivium. Okay, it was music, arithmetic, geometry, and I knew I was going to astronomy. Okay, um, that was some more advanced practical study. Okay, but everyone that was able to do so, in other words, you weren't a slave and you were somewhat rich, and you could afford tutors and time to be educated by philosophers or teachers in the area. Um, Almost always men, but surprisingly number of women as well. Young girls were also educated. Depend on what state you were in or what city. Sparta spent a lot of time educating their women in warfare and how to live in the value system they had. Anyway, grammar, logic, rhetoric. Okay. Now grammar is the first step. Young men and many times women, young boys and girls would learn grammar, Greek grammar, and in Roman times, obviously Latin grammar, and about a thousand years after that, I would guess, in different parts of the world, Rome, fell around 450 A.D., but the system, the laws, the approaches, the philosophies of the politics and economics that lasted for a long time. Okay, so grammar is in the ancient world and early medieval world was literally learning grammar. And what grammar was it? Greek or Latin? Why did you need to do this? Because it was the leaders of the society that read. Okay, literacy was rare. Literacy was powerful. All right. I mean, if you could read and write, you were way above the mass of the population in the West. Okay, so grammar was your first step. All right. Now, after grammar came logic. Okay, now logic is all about the rules of thinking. Now, Plato had a lot to say about logic, but Aristotle had more. So Plato and Aristotle really were the two that put together the first strong Western version of logic. Okay, so induction, deduction, Aristotelian logic, the syllogism, which is your hypothetical syllogism, your categorical syllogism, your disjunctive syllogism. All of that's coming from Aristotle. Okay, and they're rules of thought that appear to be self-evident, but there are some ways that you can make some mistakes. It's always good to understand what you're doing with it and to work with it. It's kind of like our ability to talk. I mean, the vast majority of Americans know how to talk, but if you want to ask them about how to talk about the syntax or grammar of a sentence, like where's the indirect object, where's the subject predicate, where's the object complement, where's the participle phrase, where's the present participle, where's the past participle, what's passive voice, what's active voice, I mean, what's subjunctive mood, what's the imperative mood, what's the optative mood. I mean, it can, and at some point many people are not going to know this. Okay, but there are rules to grammar, not the type of rules that change over time, but there are core rules of what you do with words and how you make meaning. And the more you know the names of those rules and how they work, the better you can be. You can take your skill to another level, even though without those rules, you're still going to be okay just living in the world. But you're not going to be able to advance more up here and with power that comes from confidence and clear thinking. Same with logic. Okay, so logic is not about content. It's about how to put propositions together to draw conclusions. Okay, and so you learn the grammar first, and then you can use that grammar to put together paragraphs or lines of thought that you can make a text with. All right, so grammar comes first, vocabulary, how to form individual sentences. Then logic takes those individual sentences and puts them together linearly, letting a controlling idea or ideas develop in the text, and you end up with a text. In ancient times, it was always going to be a speech, but very many times you also had writings from those that could write, had time to write, had the ability to write. That's how we know about Aristotle and how we know about Plato and Socrates. Well, we know people wrote this down. So the text is what comes from knowing the individual words and how to work with words. And you make the text. Now, for ancient times, the text was always meant to be, well, not always, but the vast majority of time, the text was meant to be a public act of speaking, to really to inform and thus eventually to persuade a city-state towards some sort of action, or within the city-state to make sure that justice and harmony was carried out. So the act of a lawyer defending a person was always going to be an act of someone giving a speech in favor of the person in front of a jury that was composed of the free citizens. By the way, it was the free people that could study this. That's why these are called the liberal arts. It really is that reason. They don't like free your mind. It's because the people that could learn this stuff were the ones that didn't have to work because they had slaves. Anyway, Rhetoric was the act of giving a speech towards a goal because you wanted to defend your client or persecute an offender, or you wanted as a city to inform some sort of policy to bring about the city's sustainability. How do we handle this plague? How do we handle this political threat? Should we build a navy, et cetera, et cetera? So rhetoric was people using grammar and logic to try to influence politics and have politics work. Politics means the activities of the populace, the polis, the city, the people. Okay, so it's just how a community works together as a unit to make decisions. That's politics in terms of the root of the word. Okay, so what I'm getting at is grammar, logic, rhetoric. We're all connected. You had to learn grammar first, then you learn logic, and then you learn how to make texts with grammar and logic, and then how to deliver it. You either memorize it or you read it, and you actually delivered it as an act of oration in front of the polis, the city, okay, the people that were called to be the deciders, the jury, if you will, or the citizens group that was listening to you, and they had the power to make the decisions. Technically, that's what that is. It really was Greek and Latin grammar. It really was Platonic or really Aristotelian logic. And then it really was. There were teachers that taught you how to have rhetorical approaches and effective strategies. These were sometimes called the sophists. But anyway, the point was all very literal. Now, in today's current educational climate, we've taken those words and we've sort of turned them into broad-ranging metaphors. No, I wouldn't say metaphors, but we've really expanded the definition. Okay, so grammar now means it could still have its technical meaning as like learning the subject and predicate and the nouns and the verbs and the adjectives and adverbs, right? But it can also mean just learning the facts of a discipline. Learning the nitty-gritty, learning the stuff that you can memorize. So if you want to go into photography, you've got to know what those buttons on the camera do, how to video edit, vet the pictures, or if you've got to learn about lighting, you have to learn what the bulbs are called and what the wattage is like and what the lumens are, and those facts, that's the grammar of photography. And then once you figure that out and you put them together, you can start building your own camera, for example, because you know how all the parts work, or you can start designing the light and the setting and the set. Um, that would be the logic of it. And then for you to actually take the pictures and then put them together in some sort of show or album or book to become known as a photographer because you are having success. People are coming to you. They are liking your work. Okay, you're able to take your grammar and your logic and you're able to put it to a rhetorical use, okay, which always means able to practically use it in a community with success according to your goals. Okay, you see how broad this has become? The grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay, so the grammar of philosophy is just you being able to know some facts about philosophy. The more, the better. And the terms: what is ontology? What is epistemology? What is axiology? What is dualism? What is monism? What is pluralism? What is the evil demon? What is the brain in the vat? What is that talking to? That's actually the phrase that people use. What's the black box? That's the mind that you can never access someone else's mind. These are phrases people use. This is the grammar. When you learn the logic of it, you begin to see how these ideas work together. What does it mean? How does it get extended? How does it show up in this thinker and in that thinker? What's the chain of influence? You get the bigger picture. Okay, you are able to understand principles and concepts. Now, if you have rhetoric, the rhetoric of philosophy is how are you using all of this to develop for yourself a system of values and beliefs that guides action, because that's your philosophy. And too many people have a philosophy that's received. They simply have a system of values and beliefs that guides action that they get from their parents, or they get from their favorite politicians, or they get from it could be any authoritative voice that they don't critically pull apart, analyze, put back together again. If they just accept it on authority, it is a received philosophy. And sometimes in trauma, or the shock of living life in the wilderness of this world, will rip that apart and leave you alienated and angst and trying to figure out how in the world to become authentic. So I think it's much better for younger people to get some of the grammar, some of the logic, and then to learn how to put it together and bring it into the real world in the community you live with the rhetoric of philosophy. Okay, so I took three terms that have an historical existence, grammar, logic, rhetoric. That was called the Trivium. You can look up the word in the internet and see what I'm talking about. And you can see what happened in ancient Rome with this, okay, and how the medieval ages took it and ran with it in their system of education. But now our modern system of education likes to use these words in broader ways. You still have the three classes, okay, so we've classified the different types of learning here. One is very factual. The other one uses the facts in sort of a systematic way to produce principles and concepts. And then the third takes the facts and the concepts and applies them practically via conviction in a way that is authentically connected to someone's life in a community or in the world. Okay, so you have those classifications, but the actual definitions are very broad now. Grammar just means the information about something. Okay. Logic means taking that information and being able to put it together so ideas are formed and so systems are developed. And then once you take that system and actually apply it in real life so that things happen, you got the rhetoric. Okay? All right. So it's good for you to know these terms. They're in current use still. And as you grow in knowledge, there's so many of these things. It's my job to try to pick the ones that I think are still worth knowing, because you still are going to run into this notion. By the way, if I'm saying that these terms are good to know because you need to understand what people are saying when they say grammar, logic, rhetoric, this is actually the grammar of the Trivium, isn't it? Okay. Now, if you really can see how they work together and can see it happen in different arenas, you can then see the rhetoric of it. Hopefully, these programs display the logic of the grammar, right, of the Trivium. And then as maybe this begins to change you in terms of giving you lifelong habits of learning, self-directed learning. That becomes the rhetoric of the trivium that we're presenting here. Now, if that was kind of thoroughly confusing, just know I rarely work with notes. Okay, it just kind of comes out, and and that may or may not make sense tomorrow for me, but it's in the film, and why not? It's like James Joyce, the famous Irish author who was dictating his one of his great books, which I don't think too much of, but anyway, I think it may have been Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, or maybe it was Ulysses, and he was dictating it to the person who was writing it down. And as he's talking, all of a sudden someone knocks on the door, knock, 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 and the person writing down the dictation writes in, knock, knock, knock. No kidding. And later on, as Joyce looks over it, he's like, "What in the world? Where did this come from?" Then they figure it out, and then Joyce says, "Leave it in. The critics are going to have a heyday with this." So, sometimes I'll do something like this, and I'm like, leave it in. May God do something with this grand mess, and maybe it will help you. Hopefully. Hey, thank you for watching.